The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on decarbonising hard-to-abate sectors for the net zero energy transition. Shouldn't just say good afternoon, I should say good morning and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Rhys Thomas. I'm the Programme Director and the Innovation Lead at Climate Action, and I'll be moderating today's webinar alongside our two presenters. So just a little bit about Climate Action for those who do not know us or haven't joined us before on a webinar or one of our live events. We were established over a decade ago, and we have a platform of digital and live events and offerings that bridge the gap between the public and private sectors, NGO and finance community. Our main goal is to accelerate the solutions for climate action and to drive forward the Paris Agreement and a net zero future. We do this through various platforms and like this one, but also we run a number of global live events. As you can imagine, with the recent COVID-19 crisis going around the world, it's been extremely difficult to host any large gatherings or face-to-face meetings. So this will actually be the first in a series of digital events that Climate Action will be hosting over the next couple of months. All of this is designed to build momentum towards one of the most important climate meetings of our era, COP26. COP26 is meant to be held in Glasgow this year. We are very aware of the current crisis and the ongoing threat to face-to-face meetings and obviously to the health of people across the world. We are planning and going ahead with the idea that COP will be happening in Glasgow this year, but we have actually had to postpone many of our live offerings in the lead up to COP. That is why we have changed and curated a number of virtual events, and indeed a COP26 webinar series. And we are now offering bespoke webinar design services for organizations that would still like to engage with their stakeholders in the build up to this crucial climate meeting. The Sustainable Innovation Forum has been around for 11 years. This has been hosted alongside the COP, the UNFCCC's annual COP negotiations for over a decade. We are looking at engaging over 1,000 delegates from the public, private, and NGO sectors. And here are some of the main themes that we'll be covering this year. If you'd like to register your interest to attend this year, please go to www.cop26.uk. Now this, as I said, will be the first webinar in a series. Here is the COP26 webinar calendar that we have been working for the past week to put together. Please again register. You will register your interest for each one of these webinars via our website, which you'll be able to find at the end of this webinar. So, on to today's webinar, Decarbonising Hard-to-Abate Sectors for the Net Zero Energy Transition. We'll be addressing two sides of the hard-to-abate sectors today, one being heavy industry and one being heavy transport. Now, many of them come with their challenges, but we want everyone to know that hard to abate does not mean impossible to abate. Today we'll be discussing those main challenges and barriers that we currently face in both sectors, but also the technological and technical solutions that we have to overcome them. We have two fantastic speakers today, which I'll introduce in a second. So over the next hour, we'll be exploring these challenges in the heavy industry and heavy transport, and we'll be taking some questions from the floor as well. So please do ask in the question box, which is on the tab on the right-hand side, or you can go onto Twitter and use the hashtag #ClimateActionLive and post a question to our page, which is at @climate_action_. So, on to our two speakers today. We have the Senior Energy, Climate and Environment Policy Advisor from UK Steel. Frank leads the UK Steel's policy and advocacy work on energy, climate change and environment. This includes the development and advocacy of UK Steel policy positions in relation to energy, climate change, environment, health and safety, but with a particular focus on UK energy pricing, energy efficiency, climate policy and decarbonisation. We have the Director of Transport and Logistics from BSR. Angie leads BSR's collaboration line of business, providing operational oversight of BSR's 20+ collective initiatives. She also drives BSR's transport and logistics practice, working with companies and stakeholders across the value chain to advance the integration of sustainability into global logistics and supply chains. So, without further ado, I will be passing over to Frank, who will be presenting first. Hi, Frank. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Frank. Let me give you the controls, and we should be good to go. Let me know if you can, if this works. Are you able to change the presentation, Frank? There we go.
It
Perfect.
looks like it. Thank you very much.
Just before, Frank, this is just a reminder of how people may ask you questions. So you can either ask questions in the question tab, or you can go onto Twitter and use the hashtag #ClimateActionLive. Over to you, Frank. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here today to speak about the decarbonisation of steel making. This is going to be done on from a UK perspective, but a lot of the things I'll be talking about today are also applicable on a worldwide scale. I will be taking you through a couple of the main kind of challenges of steel making in terms of decarbonisation, what solutions are out there, and what policies are needed. If you have any questions, as was being said earlier, then I'll be happy to go to take them at the end. Alternatively, if there's not time today, I'm happy to get in touch with you separately. So first, I thought I would just kind of I would introduce you to steel making itself and some of the challenges or kind of how steel is made as such. Broadly speaking, there are two ways. Oh, I should say before I go into that, UK Steel is the trade association for the steel industry in the United Kingdom, for anyone who do not know us. So we represent the big companies that produce steel in the UK. So how steel is made. So there's probably two ways of making steel today. One is through the kind of virgin steel production, which is usually produced in blast furnaces, where you inject coal and oxygen to remove move carbon and oxygen from the iron ore to make it into a purer form of iron, which is steel production. Which is steel in itself. The other way is through the recycled steel. That is where you kind of take scrap steel and you melt that with very high currents of electricity to produce a kind of a lower quality type of steel, but still steel production as such. And globally, on a global scale, about 70% of all steel that's produced is through virgin steel. Through the blast furnace process. I thought I'd just show you some quick pictures of what that looks like. This is first from a blast furnace site in the UK. How this kind of production, usually what they make is, because they make high quality steel, they can make flat products such as the one we're seeing here. That goes into the auto industry, it goes into machinery, manufacturing and general domestic products and the like. And various kind of high-end specialty type steels. The other way type of steel I talked about was the electric arc furnace recycled steel, which is what you're seeing here, where you poured scrap steel into and which is then being melted here through very high electric currents. that produces these kind of two type of products, such as kind of like what they call long products, either bars or wires, as I seen here, usually used in construction or rebar as such. Looking at the steel sector's emissions, so the main emissions are from the virgin steel making, where you have a lot of coal being used as a reductant. And as you can see here, this is just to illustrate where the emissions on average would come from a kind of virgin steel production site. And there you can see it's the iron making process. So it's about about like 2 tons of carbon per ton of steel that's being produced. In the UK, looking from a UK angle, these are the 6 biggest site emitters. And for them, as you can see here, the 2 biggest ones are Port Talbot and Scunthorpe, which are 2 steel sites, the rest being oil refineries. So steel is a very carbon intensive process, although I think it's a couple of percentage of the overall emissions that we are responsible for in the UK. In terms of site specific emissions, we are the biggest ones as such, so bigger, some of the biggest challenges in terms of decarbonisation. I also just want to illustrate here the emissions over the last couple of years since the 90s. As you can see here, there's quite a dramatic drop. This really correlates with the overall production level. So although we have seen general efficiency gains, I think it's about 40% lower emissions and 40% lower energy use, and thereby also indirect significantly lower emissions over the past 40 years. We have reached a plateau as such in terms of how much efficiency you can gain now. As such, in the UK, we are directly responsible for almost 11 million tons of carbon last year. I also wanted to highlight some of the things that are particularly challenging for the steel sector compared to other sectors as such, is that it's a very intensively traded product, or very trade exposed as such, with about globally speaking about 30 to 40% across national borders. In the UK, we import about 61% of our demand for steel and export again about half of our production as well. So again, very trade exposed. So that means again, when you look at kind of the market as such for steel, it means that we run very, very thin margins. Internationally speaking, there is intense competition, which has kept prices very low, but also margins very thin. That obviously means that there is any kind of additional cost you may face due to carbon pricing or various obligations you face from your government, national government. It's very difficult to pass on to your end consumer or your business consumer, whoever you sell on your steel products to, because they are unable to. They can just kind of choose someone else. They can buy their steel from Turkey, from Russia, Japan, and China, and so forth. So it's very difficult again to produce these low carbon steel products and sell them in the market when the product is like a commodity as such. Just one final option is also kind of, as I said, there's no, as such, at the moment, there is no market really, or any niche market for green steel. There's, from what we see in here, there's very few, if any, customers who are willing to pay any extra for upstream environmental qualities as such as lower carbon or lower emission steels. I'm just going to take you through now the main options for decarbonising for steel in the UK, the ones that we're looking at now. These are also applicable worldwide, but broadly speaking, these are the main options. First one, and the one that's most prevalent, I think, at the moment, is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Is where you obviously you capture the emissions from your steel production. It is one of the lowest cost options at the moment for per kind of pound per ton of CO2 captured compared to other technologies, and for the steel sector in particular, it's also one of the sectors that have the lowest kind of capture rate of all the other energy intensive industries. At the moment, that what you operate with is an assumption that you can capture about 85 to 90% of the site emissions. So there are some emissions you will not be able to capture with current CCUS technology. Looking at the cost, as I spoke before, it's quite low compared to other options, but as such, you'd probably look at over £100 additional cost per ton of steel you produce, which for the cheapest type of steel would lead to a 30% increase in cost. That is quite significant when you look at, as I was saying before, that being so trade exposed, 30% increase in cost would make your product unsellable and such. I thought I'd just mention biomass very briefly, not because it is something that's actively being considered on a worldwide scale, but it is worth mentioning because there are some interesting things here. So here you're looking at replacing the coal in virgin steel making with a type of biochar as such. It is quite an exciting option because it would, apart from obviously reducing carbon emissions, you also have the see here the option of, if you combine it with CCUS, you actually have the option of having negative emissions. So if part of your coal can be replaced with biomass, then there's the option of long-term wise going to negative emission for the steel sector, which is desperately needed according to the UN FCCC. But as I kind of put it in a bullet point, there's some questions over the supply chain and overall availability of biomass on a global scale if all steel producers were to demand biomass as such, but that's a separate discussion. Another option for decarbonising steel production is hydrogen. Instead of using coal, where you, as such, when you have use coal in steel production, you use it because of the carbon, and when it reacts with the oxygen in the iron ore, it draws out the oxygen, and obviously the byproduct is carbon emissions, CO2, with leaving more pure iron. However, you can also use hydrogen, which goes in, and the hydrogen then connects again, taking out the oxygen, with just leaving water as a byproduct rather than carbon emissions, which is a very exciting technology. There are a couple of steel companies around the world that are looking at this and experimenting with hydrogen steel making. The two ones I wanted to mention is SSAB with their hybrid project in Sweden, and Salzgitter in Germany with their Salco's scheme. However, initially, it's just worth mentioning that they are both these projects are the first projects that are looking at pure hydrogen steel making, but they have a timeline that is significantly longer than anything that we've initially been talking about at the moment, with commercial plants being fully operational in the 2030s, so quite a number of years ahead. Hydrogen steel production has been proven in the lab, but nowhere have you been able to produce a fully commercially operational steel plant yet with hydrogen. For UK setting, it's also quite difficult because one of the things that makes particularly difficult in the UK is that we have very high industrial electricity prices. So if we were to produce the hydrogen through electrolysis, it would be very expensive. Where the hybrid plant is in particular banking on having very low cost electricity with their abundance of hydroelectricity in Sweden, and especially in the north of Sweden. So the cases are quite different. Likewise, if the electricity consumption itself would be significant, you'd have for kind of on an aside, if you were to convert the current kind of a blast furnace virgin steel site to a hydrogen virgin steel site, your site electricity consumption, if through just electrolysis, would be increased by 16 times, so quite significant as well. So instead, if you were to do it in the UK, you'd probably rely on steam reforming of natural gas, where you go in and split natural gas in to get the hydrogen out, and that would obviously require CCUS as well. and as far as I'm aware, it also would require somewhat higher quality iron ore, but that's a separate matter as such. So there are some challenges to hydrogen steel production. The main one is obviously just cost and the fact that it would be probably be much more expensive compared to CCUS to decarbonize at the moment, at least. The final option I wanted to highlight in terms of steel decarbonization is electrification. This is what we already seen with the electric arc furnace, recycled steel through melting scrap, which is often mentioned as a way to decarbonize. It's not a very new technology. It's existed for over 100 years in the UK, so a very known technology. Obviously, being an electric arc, you would increase your electricity consumption on the site. So for the UK specifically, if you were to switch all our virgin steels over to scrap steel, you would see a kind of a doubling of the entire sector. But for the sites themselves, you'd see a tripling of the electricity consumption. So also worth taking in mind in terms of the challenges for the sites themselves. The reason why, in particular, electrification, electric arc, and scrap steel is not really a long-term or at least a short-term option for the UK in particular is because at the moment you cannot produce all types of steel products through recycled steel. You would simply need too high quality scrap and too finely combed scrap to be able to do that, which would be way too costly again. So certain types of flat products, automotive, domestic appliances, construction, and so forth, simply cannot be produced with scrap steel. So there are simply some products at the moment where electrification is not an option. Likewise, again, as I mentioned before, we have very high industrial electricity prices, so that makes it difficult again to see a commercial benefit in switching over. And it's also worth, from a global perspective, you could argue that it would make sense in the UK to switch over to electrification and start using more and more scrap because we have an abundant supply of scrap. But globally speaking, there is a increasing demand for virgin steel. There's simply not enough scrap in the market at the moment in the cycle, so therefore you would not be able to produce enough steel through electrification through the current kind of technologies as such, and with the resource and the demand exist. So if you just electrify the UK production, you'd likely just see a switch over of having to import the flat products, with blast furnace and virgin steel production being moved elsewhere in the world, because there will be a continued global demand for this. Finally, before kind of ending my presentation, I wanted to highlight some of the challenges. So these are the three main kind of options of steel decarbonization, which is CCUS, hydrogen, and electrification. And some of the challenges to these, to kind of integrating them and kind of finding a route to market for them, I'm going to highlight now in the coming slides. So this is where you obviously have quite a lot of existing assets installed, and again paying for the new investments in these new plants, which can be particular challenges when operating on very thin margins, very low profits as such. And to those of you from the UK, will probably be aware that the sector in the UK has been going through a very tough time lately. So the availability of capex capital within the companies themselves are probably going to be a challenge as well. There's one of the main ones long term, even if you got government assistance in terms of the initial investment, is the ongoing higher operational cost. All three options of steel decarbonization will lead to additional higher costs for your end product. As such, it's very hard to see how you can continue to operate in an international market without being outcompeted by imported high carbon steel, if somehow your ongoing higher costs are not addressed. I mentioned electricity prices already, so I'm going to go past this. So basically two models for dealing with this. How do you deal with the higher ongoing cost? Because that's the main challenge. You can always just have grants from government to say we're going to cover 36% of your capital cost, but what about the ongoing operational costs? One option is that the government simply steps in and says, we're going to pay any additional higher costs that you face through decarbonising steel production. So if a steel product costs £400 and you see an additional cost of £100 per tonne, the government will cover those. That can happen through CFD contracts and an open book model and so forth. That's currently being considered for CCUS in the UK, so very exciting to look at how that is, and they're looking to either cover that through government expenditure or add it on as a levy on electricity bills, so there would be no additional cost to any steel consumers as such. The steel industry would then be able to again compete in an international market, which is the main benefit. The alternative is to have a low carbon steel market. This is where you create and say the higher cost of steel, of low carbon steel, they will not be passed on. They cannot be passed on to the consumers in the current market. So what do you do? So you simply go in and say, we're going to use regulations or trade policies to create a low carbon steel market. The two main tools for that is kind of carbon border mechanisms. So here you go in and say, every time you import a steel product into the UK, as an example, if it is a very carbon intensive production, then you have to pay an additional cost, a carbon cost, when it's imported. The other option is simply to say, let me see if I can get that through. Sorry, I'm having a few problems. Yeah, there we are. Product standards. So where you say in the UK, you're simply not allowed to sell steel products or in our market that doesn't have a low carbon production method. So those are two of the main ones. Both are very complex, have huge ramifications in terms of trade policies, WTO compliance, and so forth. And I don't want to go into all of that, but those are the two kind of options for creating a low carbon steel market. That will enable you to pass on any additional costs you may have to consumers, because they simply will not be able to just import cheap steel, because any kind of steel you have from abroad would face the additional carbon costs that the domestic producers face as well. And the government and taxpayers will therefore not face any additional cost, but obviously steel products themselves will be more expensive to buy, and therefore consumers of cars and domestic products and machinery and manufacturing products in general will see a slight increase in their end cost. The question is, with this model, is how do you then compete in international markets in terms of, at the moment, all steel sectors, all steel production throughout the world, more or less, do have some kind of a form of export. So how do you address that? Will you get some kind of export support, or what's the kind of the method there? Just a few things to kind of highlight there. Also, obviously, you can have some form of green public procurement where the government goes in and all their steel will be low carbon. You can look at carbon taxation itself, but that is very problematic for quite a number of reasons, which I'm not going to go into now. And then again, electricity prices is a key thing. You need to have very low electricity prices again to be able to do any of these, because both hydrogen, CCUS, and electrification will see an increased demand of electricity. So from a steel perspective, as a sector, we won't be able to decarbonize without lower electricity prices. I believe that is my final slide. So I'm happy to take any. I think we have a few questions. Time for a few minutes now for questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to take them later.
Yes, thank you so much, Frank. We have had a number of questions, quite a few questions actually. So I'm going to just take back over control of the screen there so that we don't have everyone clicking through everything. So if you just bear with me 1 second, and then what we'll do is we'll move on to, we'll try and if you could answer them quickly, it would be very good to move on to the next presentation, but I would like to get through a couple of these questions. So the first question I have is, you've listed a number, you actually covered that one at the end, so I'm not going to go into this. So we have a question here, which is, would the UK steel industry welcome a carbon tax as a mechanism for decarbonising the industry?
So as such, we already have a carbon tax in form of the EU ETS that we pay. The problem with that is that because it doesn't address kind of international competition that doesn't face the same kind of carbon cost. If you increase the carbon price in the UK for steel producers, you will simply just see us being outcompeted by high carbon imported steel. And as a policy mechanism, it really just reduces the available capital that we have to put into energy efficiency and decarbonisation methods. So although we already have it and think it's a policy tool you have, for the steel sector, it simply does not work because you are so trade exposed.
Okay. I think that follows quite nicely onto this question from Maria Carvalho. How is the UK industrial strategy that was released in 2017 working with UK steel industry to invest in developing these low carbon options or reducing the capex cost for more low carbon options?
So we are working with the government on that. We're trying to work on a sector deal where we would be able to. We asked for, in particular, you'd probably not be surprised by this, by lower industrial energy prices in exchange for significant higher investment in R&D. Unfortunately, we've not been able to reach an agreement with the government on that, but the sector as such is investing in R&D through the Material Processing Institute up in north of England, and they're working on a number of ways of doing it. It's worth mentioning that all UK steel companies are international steel companies with operations around the world and in the EU. So even if R&D weren't happening in the UK, they are happening within the parent company, and they're just choosing which site is the most appropriate or most suitable for their deployment of new kind of methods. So yeah.
Fantastic. Look, we do have a number of other questions, and we will be collecting all of them, and we will make them available to Frank as well. We're going to have to move on because I'm conscious of time, but Frank, thank you so much for your presentation, and we'll hear from you at the end with a couple more group questions.
Thank you very much.
So let's move on to our next presentation, which is from the Director of Transport and Logistics from BSR. Hi, Angie. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear now. There was a little bit of a delay there, but look, Angie, why don't I hand over to you? And I'm going to give you the controls now. And I think it's best if you just start by giving everyone a brief introduction about your role at BSR and the work that you're doing in the heavy transport sector. So you should have control now, Angie.
Okay, my screen just muted me again. I'm hoping that's not going to happen again. But if I stop talking, that's why.
Okay,
so
I will.
Just bear with me there.
I'll get my team to keep an eye on that.
Okay, and can I move the slide here? So thank you very much for having me. I am delighted to be speaking to you today. I hope everybody is well in these very strange times. Today I'm going to just be presenting about decarbonising heavy transport with a strong focus on freight. So not talking about mass transit, but freight movement around the world and decarbonising that and the opportunities, challenges and recommendations for moving forward with that. I work for BSR, which is a global non-profit business network focused on sustainability. We work with a number of multinational companies and their stakeholders around the world on driving sustainable business strategies and solutions through one-to-one consulting, through research, and also a number of cross-sector collaborations. So I lead our transport practice, and through that I work with airlines, with shipping companies, with trucking companies, forwarders, etc., on their sustainability strategies, and then also very heavily on these cross-sector collaborations, of which we lead several in the heavy transport space. So through this work, we've really been able to see what's been changing, and really the focus on decarbonisation, how we can move forward with buyers and suppliers helping each other to decarbonise their value chains. We do that through a shipping initiative, which is called Clean Cargo, involving major brands, cargo carriers and forwarders who've been working through mechanisms such as sustainable procurement tools, reporting of data so that they can actually track and improve performance of suppliers, and also increasingly these sort of decarbonisation pilots that I'm going to be talking about a little later. We've replicated that in the aviation space, so working with airlines to try to do a similar sort of work, and then supporting some trucking initiatives in different regions as well. I think what I would just like to say before I move into the presentation is that we've definitely seen, through working with hundreds of companies, like the amazing opportunity that we have today to work collectively on decarbonisation efforts. And I will also point to this later on, but the increasing number of initiatives and the appetite for sort of meta collaboration between these initiatives to ensure that we're all driving in the same direction to support the industry in decarbonising, and then linking that with appropriate other stakeholders, policymakers, finance side, and securing that in the energy transition. So this presentation, I'll focus a bit on what's the current challenge, what we see are the opportunities, examples of how companies are really working on executing against those opportunities, and then some of the key things we need to have in place to see that really accelerate, particularly on the policy side. I'm going to be leaning quite heavily on lots of research that's been done by other people, and so you'll have a lot of references in here that I would definitely recommend if you want to dig into further details to read about it through their work. So just addressing the elephant in the room, why we talk about this really being a hard to abate sector. The challenge is super high. It's a very complicated sector, and the decarbonisation effort is very urgent. We see demand is obviously quite significant as global energy demand from global GHG emissions, and it's rapidly increasing. It's globally increasing, but it's especially concentrated in Asia. Secondly, climate change is already having a real impact on freight movement today. Evidence last year that the lack of rain in the Panama Canal and the Rhine River led to unprecedented restrictions and shipping delays in raw materials production. We're also seeing that damage to infrastructure caused by climate change will have a profound effect on route planning. So as well as mitigation on decarbonisation, we also need to be thinking about adaptation and how we're building and constructing infrastructure of the future. Thirdly, timing in this industry is super critical as well. Asset life cycles, if you think of a ship or a plane, is around 20 to 30 years. So we really need decarbonised solutions ready to sail and fly by the end of this decade if we want to have a shot at reaching our 2050 climate goals. And then, fourthly, and my final point here is it is complicated because policy, finance measures, and the energy transition all have to align. It's complicated also because the cross-border nature of transport. Countries themselves, through their national development commitments, can possibly cover road as setting targets and affecting sort of how that works out. But ocean and air are outside of the Paris Accord. They're outside of national development plans. They sit with other international organizations. And although they are definitely aligning now and setting more robust targets, these different pieces need to fit together quite strongly. And that takes a lot of collaboration, of course. And lastly, it's a system. We can see if we were to improve on the sea freight side, that might have a knock-on effect of having further emissions on other modes of transport. So we need to look at this as a system, creating a toolbox of solutions and creating really creative collaborations to actually see this through as a real transition that is sustainable. Though the challenge is high, we have a lot of reason to be positive if we can align all of those variables. The transition to zero carbon economy is achievable, and it has begun, and that is even for hard to abate sectors, both in heavy industry and heavy duty transport. The recent Energy Transition Commission Mission Possible report really accentuates that point, as does other decarbonisation pathways reports that have come out in the last couple of years, and a lot through what we're seeing in our work as well. So while it's identified as a hard to abate, as Reece had mentioned in the beginning, it's not impossible to abate. And we're definitely seeing signals of the potential to scale the solutions that we're seeing. And I'm going to focus on sort of 3 of these for the rest of the presentation. Firstly, when we look at what we're seeing from the company side, we're seeing increasing cases of companies making bold commitments and reporting on quite effective progress on reducing emissions. I think, you know, freight has been under the radar for a long time, and we're really seeing that its visibility now. And I think that's particularly has been driven by a lot of many companies setting science-based targets. Today, we have over 800 companies in the world who've committed to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And through that work, a lot of multinationals are realizing just how much of their Scope 3 emissions are from transportation of their goods. It can sometimes be up to 30% of their Scope 3 emissions. So this is a huge driver for performance improvement, and it's also the key, if you like, because it's such a commercial sector. If multinationals are able to influence through their supply chains to drive emissions reduction from their suppliers, then we have a shot at this. They can integrate good practices into their procurement contracts and collaborate with suppliers on solution testing, advocate with their significant voice on enabling policy, and also make sure that it's very apparent that these their value chains cross borders. So to get that mindset right about the system change that we need. Secondly, we're seeing, I mean, and I strongly see this today, more and more appetite for real collaboration along the value chain to test solutions and partner for action. Buyers of transportation services are really stepping up to say, look, let's work together through our value chain and look at how can we truly decarbonize and reduce emissions for all of us. And I'll share a couple of examples of that. Thirdly, seeing a lot of research, as I've mentioned, roadmaps for viable system-wide decarbonisation. This really gives us undeniable evidence that there are solutions and there are certain factors that we really need to align just to make sure that we can actually implement them. So a lot of reason to be positive, but a lot that we need to do collectively to drive that forward. Just to share a handful of examples here on those 3. So firstly, if we look at some of the corporate leadership examples, companies that are setting bold commitments are obviously more than those that you see on the screen, but I just wanted to highlight a couple here. If we look at HP, they've aligned their emissions commitments to the Paris Accords and committed to reduce their transportation by suppliers by 10% by 2025 on 2015 levels. Heineken has joined the Science-Based Targets Initiative in 2019 and committed to setting science-based targets for their entire value chain in line with the Paris Accords. And in logistics, they've clearly identified the ways that they're going to do that. Firstly, by optimizing routes. Secondly, by supporting their suppliers to adopt low carbon technologies. And thirdly, by investing in innovative solutions. And what I really like about what we're seeing from corporates setting targets and now is actually explaining how they're intending to do that and really looking beyond setting those targets and enforcing them on their suppliers, actually co-creating some of the solutions that they need to see. And then lastly, you see from forwarders like DHL. DHL's been a real leader in this space, but they've also articulated very clearly, so they want to improve carbon efficiency by 50%, but also do things like ensure that they continue to help their customers design environmentally friendly supply chains. So they want to have more than 50% of their sales to incorporate green solutions. There's other details behind their targets there, but I think there are 2 that really highlight the fact that the companies are now aware of their role in their value chain to both decarbonize their own operations, but support their customers and their suppliers in helping to decarbonize theirs as well. Next slide. Seems my controls are not working for a second. Yeah, okay. Another just example here, very quickly to highlight, this is DB Schenker's dashboard. And they've set clear targets, but as I've said also, that their companies are getting better and more transparent and more traceable about how they're intending to reduce emissions by segments, and really expressing the key sort of levers that they're focusing on by mode, and then how much reduction they're seeing through that. I think this is really helpful also to make sure that other companies are aware of tried and tested solutions, and that we see some best practice sharing of how these things have been implemented and how they can be replicated. It also signals definitely to innovators out there who can help partner and collaborate with these companies on driving more emissions reductions through these types of signals. And I raise this just to show that it's not the companies just making it up, of course. There is a really good set of levers that have already been identified through a number of different research reports. I really like the way this one's articulated. This is by Professor Alan McKinnon, and it's been widely cited. The key message is that we need to have a toolbox of options. Just doing energy efficiency or demand management or modal shift is not necessarily going to be the main answer, but we need to kind of blend them as far as possible, and some will be more relevant for some modes than others. Energy efficiency continues to be really critical. Obviously, is one of the easier ones as well, in a sense, because it often has very positive returns on investment, given fuel costs are about a third of operating costs for trucking, for example. And efficiency, energy efficiency right in certain modes also has a very significant impact. So up to 40% in shipping, up to 55% in aviation. The other key area really is about demand management. So where shippers have a big role to play in this, the cargo owners, is really thinking about localizing, thinking about supply chain restructuring, etc. We see demand management shooting up, demand itself, sorry, shooting up in the future, and we need to think about how we can get empower people to reduce that as well. And then the decarbonisation technologies, that some of those highlighted here are really going to be segment specific. Just some other examples that you can look at after through these slides, but just to accentuate the point of how those levers can really deliver real performance improvements in a short space of time. You can see that modal shift where possible, so moving to rail shipments, has really significant impact reduction of the CO2 emissions from IKEA. And some other ways of being quite smart about demand management and fleet efficiency are really delivering solutions and reductions. It's also relevant to know that a lot of these kind of case studies and examples exist now. So this is from the Smart Freight Centre. BSR also has a catalogue of examples that you can reference through the Future of Fuels initiative. It's worth getting in touch to just learn more about what others are doing so that you can really operationalise this quickly. Just move on quickly to then when we talk about what we mean about increased appetite and opportunity for collaborative partnerships. So we've mentioned a lot that obviously the shipping or trucking and aviation industry cannot do this alone. There needs to be real value chain collaboration. Last year, we saw a big increase in that sort of work. Obviously, there are companies that have been involved in collaborative initiatives like the Clean Cargo Working Group that we run for several years. But we've also seen a lot of interesting sort of bilateral or multilateral value chain experiments and decarbonisation pilot projects. So last year in shipping, we saw some biofuels pilots between Maersk and a group of Dutch shippers through the Dutch Growth Coalition, Sustainable Growth Coalition, and IKEA and CMA CGM did a similar kind of biofuels pilot. And these sorts of pilots really help to identify operational successes or what needs to be changed in the biofuels blend. Also, the way that you set up the types of contracts to have that work through different companies working together. We're seeing similar things in aviation, often with the airlines and then infrastructure. So how can they be working with airports and energy providers to really help to scale sustainable aviation fuels? And then we're seeing different sorts of coalitions that are coming together that bring groups of stakeholders to really think about how can we help and collaborate to look at identifying zero emission vehicles of the future. I'm very conscious of time. I've just got a couple more slides here to get through. So just two more things. So first, on the decarbonisation pathways, as I mentioned, that's another thing that we're really seeing, really good, well articulated and clear decarbonisation pathway plans through a number of different research reports. First, Mission Possible, Lloyd's Register has also done the same, and the OECD ITF as well. So this is a sample, an example of how the the Energy Transitions Commission have laid it out for trucking. We're looking through demand management, energy efficiency, and decarbonisation technologies, how much impact that can have, and the sort of timescale where there's transition fuels versus longer term solutions. Also identifies where there's a need to drive different levers to operationalize these improvements. Sorry, I'm again having trouble moving the slide. A couple of things on decarbonisation in shipping examples. So other reports have identified where savings can be made from an operational, technological and fuels perspective. This is obviously different compared if you're looking at a container ship to a breakbulk vessel, etc. They all need to be tried and tested with more pilot projects, and so we can look at scale and bringing down costs. I just want to highlight one thing which I think is very important, that when we look at technological solutions, that's one aspect, but we also need to look at what's happening on the business decision-making side and the demand management. So if we do see changing trade patterns in the future that moves towards more regional trade, this could imply that short voyages could increase, and that could help on the decarbonisation journey as well. Therefore, innovators should start thinking about how can we really invest and improve battery design for those sort of short sea vessels. Lastly, a couple of points here. So just to say, I think how we need to move forward. So we need more scalable system-wide action. Bold policies, bold climate policies will drive business action and create reinforcing ambition loops. And all stakeholders have a role to play in this. I've got a lot of things to say about this, but I know that I'm running out of our time. So really, this makes us look at three things. So companies have to develop strategies for efficiency, modal shift and acceleration of the development, deployment of low carbon fuels and vehicles, and that really will entail new partnerships with government and civil society, industry, peers and customers. But every actor in the value chain has a critical role to play in the demand levers, but also setting the policy environment and financial incentives in the right place. On the left-hand side, I've highlighted some of those key actions that we see, and happy to go into detail about those another time. But the setting of ambitious, clear emission reduction goals from governments and authorities is going to be really critical to drive the type of focus that we need. But supporting those targets with comprehensive set of policy measures and aligning them with financial incentives is also critical. So supporting research on zero emission vessel technologies, regulations about how to shift to low carbon fuels, enforcing energy efficiency standards in vehicles, pricing carbon, etc., is also critical. And then further, I mean, the industry themselves and industry collaborations really need to create more demand for products and services that have a green offering. And this is our role to see that articulated and make sure it's visible for others to be able to replicate. Last point I just wanted to make here is that there's no need to reinvent the wheel if you're a company or a country looking at how to get involved in decarbonising transportation. There are several initiatives. Again, I just need to move the slide to the last slide here. Don't know if you've got control of there are several initiatives that are in place already and several organizations that are there to support you in implementing some of the ideas that I've shared today, and making sure that we get the collaboration that we need to look at the policy and financial frameworks that we need to make that work. I'll leave it there. I understand with time constraints.
Hi, Angie. Thank you so much for that presentation. And yeah, sorry about the slight technicals there. I think sometimes I was moving your slides and sometimes you were. Look, I know from speaking to you for the last couple of weeks, Angie, that you could have talked about this for a very long time. And with you, Frank, and we do indeed have a lot of questions coming in. However, we do only have a couple of minutes left. So what I wanted to do is, Frank, I'm going to bring you back in. Can you hear me?
Yes, I should be able to hear you now.
Fantastic. And Angie, you still on the line?
I am.
Fantastic. So I feel like there's a couple of questions that I'm going to try and put together and ask the both of you. So I think between heavy shipping and or heavy transport, and particularly shipping in this case, and indeed heavy industry in this case study that we had today, the UK steel industry, there seem to be quite a few. There seem to be two things. One thing that is very reliant on a kind of whole systems energy transition, which seems to be quite evident across the two. But secondly, there seem to be technologies there today and technological solutions there today that offer kind of tangible solutions that we can enact today, like CCS and biogas. I think were the two that stood out for me that crossed over into the two industries. Frank, I'll start with you. What's the greatest challenge in making these competitive or making these attractive to organisations, and what do we need to do to make that happen?
I think the main barrier as such, and what the main challenge is government policy. Unfortunately, there's only, because the industry is so trade exposed, as I kind of alluded to in my presentation, there's very little you can do yourself as a sector if you do not have the customer demand for and willingness to pay a premium for your product. As such, there needs to be government intervention into the market to address this kind of this failure of the market, to either where the government goes in and absorbs the cost of the higher cost of decarbonising steel or glass or any other kind of foundation materials, or simply create a market, low carbon market. So the main kind of challenge is the lack of clear government intervention in the markets at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much. And Angie, what do you think the greatest challenge is in developing the technological solutions for the transition of heavy transport?
I would definitely agree with Frank. I mean, I think it's really aligning the policy and the financial incentives to just gear us towards the direction of focusing on the handful of technologies that will have the greatest effect, and ensuring that we can develop those, bring them to scale, and thus drive down the cost. So if everybody can align behind the best options, say driving down the cost of ammonia, looking at really how do we get the most sustainable biomass, driving down the cost of electrolysis and efficiency of hydrogen fuel cells and tanks, etc. We already know what the solutions are. We know what the kind of policy mechanisms and financial incentives that are needed. And it's really about making sure that we can set that framework and have kind of a global agreement on what is a very fragmented industry. So it's a challenge, but it's feasible because we know what the pathways need to look like, and we just need the political and the financial and the energy sector sort of commitment to go in the same direction.
Fantastic. And I guess this leads on to the final question that I think we will finish on to the both of you as well. Obviously, 2020 is an extremely important and pivotal year for climate action across many industries. From both of your perspectives, I guess from you first, Frank, from Make UK's perspective on behalf of the UK steel industry, what will you be bringing to COP this year, and what are the demands that you'll be bringing, and what are the kind of major actions that you'll be bringing to the UNFCCC's COP in Glasgow this year?
So I think from our perspective, the clear thing we're bringing is a direct request to, obviously from a UK perspective, is we wish the UK government and the EU for that matter to take leadership and to take a step forward in this, kind of show the level of ambition and say that we will be decarbonising our foundation industries. We will be decarbonising glass production, steel production, chemical production, ceramics, cement, and so forth. And we will be addressing the market failures that are currently happening. That is what you need now. So from our perspective, the things that we will bring to COP26 is a clear kind of request to the UK government and to world leaders to take a step forward, to outline clear steps that they'll be taking to decarbonize steel, and how they're going to address the issues of kind of being a very trade exposed sector, where not one single company can take unilateral actions in the current market.
And Angie?
Similarly, but I'd say one is going to be really clear case study examples. So through some of the coalitions, the We Mean Business, Mission Possible platform, others that we're working with, Clean Cargo and Getting to Zero Coalition, etc. Examples of clear operational pilot projects that we need to scale. We need to, and two other aspects. One would be a clear signal of what conditions are needed to ensure that we're de-risking and creating an operating environment that doesn't negatively affect first movers. So what those that need to be established from a global framework perspective, and then clear examples and requests for national determined commitments and how they could incorporate better targets on decarbonising transport in the country level.
Fantastic. And look, we are literally just out of time. It's 4 o'clock now here in the UK. So look, I just want to say thank you very much for everyone who is listening, for tuning in. We've had a fantastic response to this webinar today. We had over 800 people subscribe, and I think live we had almost over 300 people live at one point. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to our two presenters, Frank and Angie, today as well. This will be this presentation will be available to download once the webinar has finished. You will all receive an email and you'll be able to watch this live and watch this back. But in the meantime, I just wanted to, on the screen that you can see here now is our upcoming webinars. Please do go onto our website and register your interest for to attend and listen to our COP26 webinar series. But in the meantime, thank you very much, both of you, Frank and Angie, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you. All the best.